Billy Yank, time traveling to whatever year this is. Civil War, Battles and Events, day 2.
Oh my God. Let me eat it. I wonder if you can put these on. Put this on. Alex, put it on your head small. Your head is small. Before somebody carries you back, then don't sit beside me.
Yeah. Yeah.
You look big.
I got money on table.
But we got your shit up there.
Got my shit up. Oh God.
Oh God, you don't want this.
See this?
I was gonna high five you. See? Fine. High five. High five. See, I got what I want.
You wasn't gonna high five you. I know that look on that face.
I was. I don't fuck with you. I don't fuck with y'all Negroes like that with God. Man, remember you live behind me. Fuck you. Fuck you. God, what you want?
Whoa.
Okay, Lee Thomas, Apple Reynolds, come to the front office. KK Thomas, Apple Reynolds.
Oh no. Hey, Ross.
Go kill some Yankees. Yeah, go kill some Yankees.
To the fort now.
Thumbs up.
To the fort.
Thumbs up.
Up, Sammy.
Already?
Yeah.
It don't matter if you before the bell rings.
And the tape,
Yeah.
the daggone computer
30
is
seconds.
recorded
30
today.
seconds.
I will.
Where yesterday?
I know.
Go kill some Yankees, son.
Oh God, where's he at?
Watch out.
Thumbs up.
She just tried to stab me.
Oh, Charlie, what you doing?
Use the camera. You gotta have a witness.
No.
He's been recording for 3 minutes, bro. What the world? He wasn't even in here 3 minutes ago. We got new students. You was dead? Huh? Yeah. Yeah. He was dead.
And ISS.
What you want the OSS for?
Her and Gentleman Paul.
Jalen?
Yeah.
I want to see the video.
There wasn't no video.
Hey!
She's trying to stab me.
Who won? Who won?
Riley. It was Riley. Yes.
I know you mad.
You're gonna
You mad.
sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Hurry up, Alex. You're taking so long.
I ain't got no filter.
Why are you walking like that?
Let's rush to the
I just see the glories. Yeah, there you go.
It happened again.
Oh man, it happened again. What is it this time? 2065? Like when am I?
2024.
2024? Oh.
Lucky for y'all, I've traveled as far as 2065 before, so I'm familiar with some of your newfangled things. Now, you know, some of these things still catch me off guard, like those devil's devices. Y'all got in the pouches over there. It still trips me out every time. But hey, I got a question. Did Johnny find his way in here yesterday? Yeah. Oh, that just means I'm gonna have to tell you the true story. I'm gonna have to set you straight. Was he saying things like that tyrant up north and the war of northern aggression?
It's the girls and the boys basketball players.
That probably really freaked him out, didn't it? Yeah. I like I said, I've time traveled before, so this is these technologies are not all new to me. Now, the tricky part is not getting into the future. The tricky part is definitely getting back to where you came from. 'Cause I'm telling you, I swear, I was in the woods just a few
They
minutes
don't come
ago.
to the front office, Santiago.
Well, since we're here, I imagine we might as well get about to telling the story of the Civil War day number 2. So if you'll pick up where you left off, you'll help our new recruit here find a page that we're on. Pick up where we left off, and anything that Johnny said yesterday that's wrong, I'll be sure to correct us on today. Let's see what we got here. Oh, that's that new steak sauce. Let's see here. Okay. Well, what's that? So in the middle of the Civil War, someone was like, you know what this country needs? A delicious steak sauce. Yeah, 1862. That was just last year when the guys invented this new steak sauce. It's kind of funny that we're all fighting each other and someone's thinking about inventing a steak sauce. So next time you get your hands on some of that A1, you can notice the year 1862 and you can realize that it was developed in the middle of the Civil War. Steak sauce. A1, you know what I'm saying?
Put that on anything.
Well, hey, I'm sorry. I'm not even sure I've introduced myself yet. My name's Billy Yank. Billy Yank represents the average Union soldier, Northern Federal soldier. And, well, I'll be telling you the second half of the story of the second half of the Civil War here today. I imagine, did you leave off with, it looks like you left off with Antietam yesterday? Now, I'll refer to this as Antietam because Antietam was a creek nearby the Sharpsburg battlefield, but Johnny yesterday, he probably was calling it Sharpsburg. Yeah, those Confederates, those Southerners have a different way of naming the battles. They're always naming it after a town, and Union soldiers like myself, we're always referring to it after a body of water that was nearby. So Antietam is how we are going to refer to it in this class. What'd you learn about Antietam? What characterizes Antietam? Yeah. Listen, I was there. These eyes have seen some things. It was a bloody day. I'm kind of curious about the infographic here. Remember, I've traveled forward before, so I remember some of these. That hurricane in Galveston, Texas, pretty deadly day, 8,000 deaths. And then right below it is Antietam. Antietam is the single bloodiest day in U.S. military history, only eclipsed by the hurricane in Galveston for total deaths. Number 3 there, I know what your September 11th is. I know what that means to this country. Less than 3,000 killed on September 11th, less than Antietam. Remind me, it is kind of hard to keep track of all these dates. I know history students are always complaining about dates. What was going on in December of 2020? COVID. What? That sounds like a virus of some sort. Oh yeah, that's the 19 variant. Y'all just wait for that COVID 50. Whew, it's coming. But it looks like there were 3 bad days in December of 2020. In the deaths, American deaths in the 2000s, even so, not eclipsing the deaths at the battlefield of Antietam. And then even on the list there, Pearl Harbor, less than. American deaths at Normandy on D-Day, less than the deaths on one day, September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam in Sharpsburg, Maryland. So we're making a pretty simple point here. It was a very, very bloody day. Many people who are there have stories of horror. Miss Hannah Ann, I remember that nice Southern name, Miss Hannah Ann.
Why does it say 2.461?
That should be a comma. That should be a comma. Someone tweeted that out bad. I know what Twitter is. I'm a time traveler. I've been some places. So here's how, I do notice your notes here. Here's how I want you to finish out your memory aid in that circle on Antietam. I want you to draw something like blood splatter, blood dripping, blood and guts, gunshot with blood, anything to recognize, to remember. Coca-Cola, I'll tell you what, some of Atlanta's finest. You just wait till
day.
now back in the day. Woo, that Coca-Cola. You know what that Coca stands for? Woo! It's a medicinal. Medicinal. I want you to draw a blood spatter to recognize that Antietam was the bloodiest day in U.S. history. Now I'll give it to you one other way. Antietam starts with the letter A. A is the first letter of the alphabet. It is the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. A, number one, single bloodiest day in U.S. history. So I've taught a lot of classes across time and history. Like this time travel thing just keeps happening to me. So I find that that's an easy way for students to remember the Battle of Antietam. Oh, there we are. That's me and Johnny crossing bayonets. Yeah, I tell you, it almost happened like that on one particular engagement. Battle of Antietam goes to the boys in blue. It was a hard-fought victory. I'm telling you, my eyes have seen some things. Battle of Antietam goes to the boys in blue, Union victory. Well, let me kind of jump into my piece of the story here. Following the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln does something pretty significant on the political landscape. He issues what is known as the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation, real fancy word for freedom. Proclamation, making a declaration. So basically the freedom statement, if you will. The Emancipation Proclamation or the Freedom Statement. Lincoln uses the military victory at Antietam to advance some of his political goals. He wanted to do this not while the Union Army was fighting from behind, losing. He wanted to do it on the heels of a victory, as if to come from a position of strength. So using the victory at Antietam, Lincoln issues this document that frees all slaves in the rebelling states. Now, I got to use the word all carefully. Did not free all slaves. There are the states that were called the border states, remained in the Union, but still maintained slavery. President Lincoln actually didn't free the slaves in the border states, states that have remained loyal to the Union, but he did free slaves in the rebelling states. Here's the deal. It really didn't have much of an impact immediately. Think of it like this. Union folks like myself, soldiers like myself, we still hadn't really made it into the heart of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida. So if you're a plantation owner, you're a slave owner in Montgomery, Alabama, wretched place, about there eventually. If you're a plantation owner in Montgomery, Alabama, and you hear of the tyrant up north, now that's how you're going to think of him. You hear that tyrant up north issuing this freedom proclamation. Are you going to be like, well, golly gee, that's my president. I guess I have to free my slaves. You going to do that? No, you're going to be like, that tyrant up north has no authority over me. And of course, you're going to continue to maintain your humans in bondage, slaves in bondage. But here's what we were hoping for. Here's what President Lincoln was hoping for. He was hoping that the word would spread by word of mouth from one plantation to the next. And that as these humans in bondage, I don't even like using the word slaves. So let's not forget what they are. They're humans in bondage. As these humans started to hear of the proclamation, maybe that would inspire them to escape to the north or escape to Union-held territory. See, this applied to every territory held by the Union Army. And actually, as the war progressed, as we continued to advance into those Southlands, every time we maintained a new area, we would free the former slaves in those parts. I'm going to use the word former because at that point they would become former slaves. Many of them actually found our cause right and just and enlisted in the military or joined us as some camp supporters. Really made a big difference to the Union war effort. Here's really the big take on this. It gives a moral purpose to the war. See, slavery at the outset, a lot of people, still in that debate about, is it the states' rights? Is it federal overreach? Is Lincoln behaving like a tyrant, like a lot of them South folks are going to say? Well, this makes it pretty plain. President Lincoln is fighting the war to free the slaves. He wants to emancipate with each new Union victory. Now he wants to bring the South states, those secession states. That's the word I use for the states that broke away. They seceded. A lot of times we use the word secession. Those secession states, he wanted to bring them back into Union and also wanted to free the slaves on each of their plantations. So it really gives a moral purpose to the war. And what that does is deter foreign nations from supporting that Confederate cause. See, it'd be one thing to join in with your trade partner. Britain likes Southern cotton, right? They do a lot of trade with the South for cotton and tobacco. But it'd be totally different to be supporting a slave nation. And that's what this proclamation does. It draws the line. It says you're either fighting to maintain slavery or to free these humans in bondage. That's the very significant thing about this Emancipation Proclamation. I'll show you this map here, really illustrate what I'm describing. States in blue, of course, those are the states in the Union. States in red, those are the secession. But it's those states with the shaded colors. Now they remained in the Union, but they continued to have the institution of slavery. President Lincoln was very savvy. President Lincoln knew how much the country could handle and how fast the country could handle. I firmly believe our president wanted to wipe away slavery from the outset of the war. But he knew it was a very tentative balance, maintaining a unity in the country. If he had declared the border states slaves to also be free, by gosh, they would have joined the secession real fast. Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, they would have joined the red states real fast. So it's a very tentative, delicate political balance that President Lincoln was the fine line that he was walking here. Overall, very good decision, and ultimately makes the Union cause one of emancipation. Now I'll say this, following the Battle of Antietam, which was in September of 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation, actually, golly gee, look at this, I got a copy of it right here on some real life parchment paper. Pretty difficult handwriting to read. This is government work for the time period, right? You know, today we think about laser printed, colored ink, jet copies of a document. This is an official document coming from the desk of the president back in 1862. The original Emancipation Proclamation was really kind of a pre-proclamation. He did declare to the secession states, hey, if you rejoin the Union before January 1st of 1863, we will allow you to be a border state. We'll allow you to maintain your slavery. The goal was to bring the states back into Union, and he would continue to advance on the slavery later. Now, none of the secession states did that. On January 31st, a lot of people were really wondering if Lincoln was going to go through with his proclamation. One of the chief people wondering if he would go through is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, a far outspoken abolitionist. Frederick Douglass really often believed Lincoln wasn't moving fast enough. He was really frustrated by how slowly the president was advancing towards emancipation. Well, on January 1st, 1863, this would be the day Lincoln was set to actually sign the document. Not the pre-proclamation, but the actual document. Seeing as it was New Year's Eve into New Year's Day, the president had been at a New Year's Eve party. And as the clock struck midnight, a lot of people were wondering, is he going to sign it right now? Is he going to sign the thing right now because it's January 1st? Well, President Lincoln, having shaken so many hands that night at the party, he says he does not want to sign with a shaky hand, right? He's shaking so many hands, his hand's tired. He didn't want anyone to see a little hitch in his signature and have them wonder if he was hesitating. So he goes to bed, gets a good night's rest, and in the morning, to little fanfare, gathers his cabinet in his office, not some big proclamation, not some big ceremony, to little fanfare, signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and with such opens the door to African Americans joining the military and serving in a blue uniform, just like this. So key takeaways on the Emancipation Proclamation. I want to make sure I said this well. Free slaves in the rebelling states only. We are still working towards full emancipation with a constitutional amendment. Last thing I stated there was opens the door to African Americans serving in uniform. Look at this. This is an amazing photograph of a former slave and his family serving in a blue uniform, wearing a blue uniform just like this. Over 200,000 African Americans would serve in the Army and 10,000 in the Navy. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, many African Americans signed up to fight. One of the most famous units, there were many, but one of the most famous units becomes the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment out of Boston. So Boston, Massachusetts, a free state. Boston holds a recruiting drive for all African Americans interested in joining the Army. Unfortunately, there was still segregation. Okay, it was a segregated all-black unit. They were led by white officers. So enlisted could fill the ranks of the soldiers up to the rank of the sergeant major, but all the officers were white. Many of them were abolitionists or from abolitionist families, sympathetic to the cause of these recently free-formed slaves. So 54th Massachusetts fills its ranks in Boston, Massachusetts. Man, just look at that. That's amazing to think. It really putting some backbone to the fight against slavery. See, it's no longer just a white politician's fight, no longer just a northern fight. African Americans now are wearing the uniform and holding the rifle and fighting the battles right alongside Union soldiers like myself for their own freedom. One of the greatest emancipation movements of all time from the north to the south, literally freeing themselves. And you got to imagine a lot of them being split from their families. Families sold different directions over the previous decades. A lot of them fighting for the freedom of their families as well. Briefly tell you the story of the 54th Massachusetts. So they were a segregated unit, but they were led by white officers. Their colonel is a man named Colonel Joshua Gould Shaw, Colonel Shaw, and he was from a prominent abolitionist family. He himself believed the abolitionist cause. He had seen action at Antietam, so I do believe my regiment was right next to him at Antietam. He saw the same things I saw. Well, when the 54th Massachusetts is raised, he volunteers to be the colonel. He wants to make sure these men are treated well, trained well, and given an opportunity on the battlefield. At the outset of African Americans enlisted in uniform, a lot of them were used for work-intensive jobs. Certainly not slavery, but not the frontline combat. They were used to build fences, build pickets, pull guard duty, and build up the fortifications at each new base. Not a lot of opportunity to prove themselves in battle. So Colonel Shaw, he wanted to make sure his regiment had a chance to prove themselves in battle. I mean, by gosh, if they're going to train and drill and hold the rifle, doesn't make sense that they wanted to be used in battle. So this is called the Battle of Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. And the night before the battle, okay, it's a fort held by the Confederates in South Carolina. Night before the battle, it was becoming obvious that the Union is going to advance on the fort the next day. And the commanders have all gathered to determine the order of march. Who's going to go first? Who's first, who's second, who's third, who's reserve, and such like that. You can see it's right on the coastline. This fort is literally on the sands of Charleston Harbor. So that's the ocean just right off in the distance there. A certain number of ironclads off in the distance. Well, Colonel Shaw, on the night before the battle, he volunteered to his commanding officer. He said, "Sir, let the 54th Massachusetts lead the way tomorrow." And the general said, "Colonel Shaw, are you sure you want your African-American regiment to lead the way tomorrow?" He said, "Yes, sir. Let my men prove themselves in battle. They will not let you down." Now, this volunteering, this was going to come at a cost. Units that led the way certainly absorbed a lot of fire, and bullets, and many casualties in leading the way. But even so, Shaw wanted his men to have the opportunity to prove themselves, and the men themselves wanted to have the opportunity to prove themselves. So, on the day of the battle, July 18th, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment leads the way to Fort Wagner. And unfortunately, this is a battle where the Confederates prevail. They do hold the fort. The 54th Massachusetts fought bravely, fought valiantly. Many of them cut down, many of them died leading the way. And in the picture we see here, we see Colonel Shaw with his sword. Now, it's not photography, it's a painting. But we see Colonel Shaw with his sword being cut down right next to his men. He died right alongside many of his troopers, freedmen wearing blue, just like he was. And Colonel Shaw was shot next to them and died right next to them. And what happens next is kind of an amazing piece of the story. So I'll show you this first. This is a monument to Colonel Shaw in the 54th Massachusetts that's in Boston to this day. He is recognized as being a key leader, an abolitionist leader, and really kind of proving that the African-American soldier is just as good as any other soldier. And so this is a bronze monument to them in Boston today. Well, what happens next? This is a picture of Colonel Shaw, okay, true to life. This is his picture right here. When the Confederates were clearing the damage of the battle over the next couple days, right, and there's thousands of bodies to deal with. Well, what was very standard was to bury the enemy into a mass grave. That makes sense, right? I mean, you gotta clean up the hygiene. You don't want bodies rotting that can spoil your food, spoil your water, cause disease. So to treat a way that the enemy was treated is that they were just buried into a mass grave. Now, it was traditional, if you recognize an officer on the battlefield, to pull him aside, and give him full military honors. Maybe even send him home to his family. Couldn't do it for all the thousands, couldn't get all the bodies home, but a lot of times officers were treated with extra dignity. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying it's normal that officers were treated with extra dignity. Well, when the Confederates came upon Colonel Shaw's body, and it was obvious because he had rank on his shoulders, he had a special hat indicating his rank, came upon Colonel Shaw's body, the only white man, surrounded by many other African Americans who had died in the battle as well. They put him into this mass grave right alongside his soldiers. And the Confederates, they kind of saw it as an insult. They said, we're going to bury this officer with a bunch of the black soldiers. And that's an insult to him. Well, when word got to Colonel Shaw's family, The Union Army said, Shaw family, we can exhume the body, we can dig it up from the grave, we can set it aside and give it full honors. Here's what his father said. He said, we can imagine no holier place than that in which he lies among his brave and devoted followers, or wish him any better company. He's saying, my son is right where he wants to be, right where he belongs. He's with the men that he loved, the men that he trained, the men that he died with. My son didn't see color in his troopers or himself. He just saw soldiers. So what the Confederates intended for an insult, Colonel Shaw and his family saw as an honor that he rests with the men who he fell with. Fast forward a little bit to the rest of the story there. In this mass grave, as they buried these soldiers in the mass grave actually started to contaminate the water supply of the fort, the fresh water, the drinking water. So the Confederates had to leave the fort. The Union didn't win the battle, but just a few short weeks later, the Confederates had to vacate the fort because of a contaminated water source. So interesting little extra there. This whole story, the story of the 45th Massachusetts, is told in this movie called Glory. Movie's a little bit older, came out in the year 1989. I know none of y'all were born yet. I was already old man. But you see some A-list actors there. Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman. You do the deep voice. Very powerful story, very good movie, generally accurate to all the facts of history as well. So we might have time to watch a little bit of a clip in class later, not today, but a little bit later. Good movie. If you're ever scrolling looking for movies, good movie, recommended. All right, we are at the time of our porcelain throne break. I call it the latrine, but you guys have these indoor facilities. So let's go to the latrine and take care of our business. Come on back and finish the story. So what? Oh, I can do that.
I'll be here all next week.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. All right, you know the deal. Good classroom. Trust you. The exam is 2 Fridays from now, so you're gone for the week, and don't tell the whole week. So I trust you. I should have signed it Billy Yank.
That's why I didn't think she behaved like me. Because her sister before me died.
Up, 2, 3, 4. Up, 2, 3, 4. Up, 2, 3, 4. Up, 2, 3, 4.
I would call my mama. For sure. And I text her. And we was chit-chatting for a bit. And then that's when Haley was texting.
Where they at? Barber! Private Barber!
No, I was just doing what I
And Barber?
You're scaring me. Where'd they go?
I was surprised that she said something.
Brody, Sam.
So they went on a side mission or something?
They went on a side.
Or he finna write all of them.
Let's go push-ups.
I can't wait for my hair to grow back.
Twenty, Sam. 20.
Now where's Brody?
Let's go back to the old. No. No. You got your pants off. Work detail. Work detail.
Yeah, I say watch the children.
Billy Yank's gonna have to get on to that next week. All right, fam. I'm not worried about who's not here. I'm worried about who is here. So let's jump into back with your notes. You know the deal. I like to give y'all familiarization with certain topics, and then of course I like to hammer the key topics. So this brings us to the summer of 1863, little place I like to call Gettysburg. Gettysburg is going to be known as the high watermark of the Confederacy. Here's what that means. Two things. First of all, it's the strongest the Confederate Army ever was. Okay, it's the biggest Robert E. Lee's army was. It's the most strength that they had. So it's the best situation they were ever at. That's high in one term. High in the other term is the farthest north that they're ever going to go. They're going to break into Pennsylvania. The only time they ever actually enter into Union territory, and the purpose was to try to bring the war to the north, try to bring the war to Washington, D.C., try to make the Union Army want to say, whoa, 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 we don't want war on our land, and negotiate terms of surrender, or terms of peace, at least. So it's going to be called the high water mark of the Confederacy for those two reasons. Here is a map of the area. So Lee, where it says the word Lee, that's Virginia. You can see he cuts north into Maryland, one of those border states. And then that border that he crosses is Pennsylvania, and Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. So there's the Pennsylvania line. He crosses into the Union territory, and this is the highest that a Confederate army will come in the entire Civil War. Now, there's a couple theories about how the fighting happened at Gettysburg. One of the myths that has been bought into in historical realms is that the Confederates were looking for a shoe factory. They heard that Gettysburg had some supplies, such as clothing, shoes, and such. So hey, let's go see if we can get some shoes at Gettysburg. Probably not really accurate, because there's not a shoe factory at Gettysburg or anywhere nearby. Although it sounds like a nice little story. Okay, the Confederates were low on supplies. They're trying to get shoes. All of a sudden, we have a big battle on our hands. Realistically, what really happened is that all roads in the area essentially lead to Gettysburg. It's hard to navigate in southern Pennsylvania without coming to Gettysburg. And as it were, Lee's army from the south, General George Meade's army from the north, they find themselves at Gettysburg. They find themselves at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. So there's a setting the scene on Gettysburg there. I like this picture. Also kind of illustrates the confusion of battle and how the flags could also be confusing. We continue to talk about how the Confederate stars and bars looks a whole lot like the American stars and stripes. Of course, we know it looked a whole lot like Georgia state flag. We had that conversation yesterday. Here's for your notes here. So what is the Battle of Gettysburg? What do you need to know? Lee invades Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. Over 3 days of fighting in July, Union forces ultimately defeat the Confederate forces, and this is going to be considered a major turning point in the war. Imagine if you're Bobby Lee, you're the Confederates, you enter Pennsylvania feeling pretty good about yourself. We have invaded north,
If we do good up here, we can sue for peace. We can make the Yankees give us our own lands, just like we've been rebelling for. So you enter Pennsylvania feeling pretty good, but you're going to leave Pennsylvania 3 days later feeling really not good. And actually, of course, you're going to leave behind a lot of dead and wounded as well. Lee loses a big piece of his army. Now, there's a lot of iconic things about Gettysburg, several events that, this isn't a military tactics class, so I'm not going to tell you every little piece of the military history there, but I will mention some of the big names, the big events, the things you ought to know coming out of history class. So the days that it actually fought on July 1, July 2, and July 3, 1863. What's that bringing us real close to?
4th.
That really special day, that sacred American day of July 4th. That's right. So I got to imagine that was on everybody's mind, certainly on my mind. Me, Billy Yank, I fought at this battle. So everybody's thinking about that original independence. And here we have ourselves fighting one another just a short 87 years later on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. In total, there's going to be 170,000 participants between the two sides. So what this means is that there's going to be a lot of families with their family has a history at Gettysburg for generations to come, right? Families go home to the north, soldiers go home in the north, soldiers go home in the south, and they tell the story of Gettysburg. So you're going to have children who say, my daddy fought at Gettysburg. Then you're going to have grandkids who say, my grandpa fought at Gettysburg. Then you're going to have great-grandkids who say, yeah, I remember talking to my great-grandpappy. He fought at Gettysburg. He told me his stories. So for a long time, Gettysburg is going to be a really kind of a family folklore thing. And I got to imagine as time went on, the stories grew and each soldier maybe embellished his participation at Gettysburg. Big takeaway, Lee loses about a third of his army. So 33%. 1, 2 dead, 1, 2 dead, 1, 2 dead, 1, 2 dead, 1, 2 dead. Get it? Every third person in the room not coming home. And if you remember the makeup of the South, they didn't have a lot of soldiers left to fill the ranks. So when Bobby Lee lost a soldier, he didn't have another one waiting to come and fill the ranks. He just lost that soldier. So very significant loss overall. In total, now this is both sides combined. In total, there are about 10,000 killed across 3 days and 30,000 wounded across the 3 days. This is the single deadliest battle in the Civil War. Now, across 3 days, okay, not a single day, but across 3 days, this is the single deadliest battle in the Civil War. The reason we call it a turning point, I hope you remember this term from previous learning. Turning point means that the momentum has shifted. Not that the war is over, we still got more war to fight. But at this point, it's almost like Union victory is a matter of time after this battle. The momentum has shifted to the north, just a matter of time until victory after this battle. Couple of pictures there, primary source pictures. You see the dead on the battlefield. The one military thing I'm going to kind of tell you about, like I said, I could show you a lot of maps and tell you a lot of the military tactics. That's not what this class is designed to do. But the one thing that was particularly devastating and shaped the battle is known as Pickett's charge. On the second day of the battle, General Lee orders one of his other generals, General Pickett, to charge the Yankee positions, but it's across 1.5 miles of open field. So Pickett follows orders, General George Pickett follows orders. He sends his men for 1.5 miles across the open field. Now, if they were able to arrive at full strength, they may have been able to break through the Union lines. But you understand how warfare works. If you got an open field, you got a good shooting lane for the cannons. You got a good shooting lane for the snipers and the riflemen. By the time Pickett's troopers arrived at the Yankee lines, they've been cut down almost to nothing. A devastating military move. In 15 minutes, Lee lost a whole brigade. Pickett lost his entire brigade, right? They were combat ineffective after Pickett's charge. So a lot of historians like to look at Pickett's charge as a moment that Gettysburg shifted. And then, of course, Gettysburg is the moment that the whole war shifted. So it is not an exaggeration to say that Pickett's charge is perhaps the moment that the Confederates started to lose the war. There's a couple of other big names that come out of Gettysburg. The Angle, Pickett's charge was actually going to go attack the Angle. Little Round Top, this is where Colonel Joshua Chamberlain holds strong. Cemetery Ridge, Seminary Ridge, these are all positions where battles happen, smaller battles happen inside of the big battle of Gettysburg. So you could definitely go on and on and on and nerd out on Gettysburg. Here's a way that you can do that. There's a great movie called Gettysburg. It's a very long movie, actually. It's pretty historically accurate. Cool thing about it, it was actually filmed on the land of Gettysburg. Gettysburg today, of course, is a national park. It's something you can go and visit. I've never been personally. Well, Billy Yank has been. Mr. Swanson, I've never been personally. I would love to. Gettysburg, the movie, was actually filmed on the territory, on the actual terrain. Of course, there's some A-list actors there depicting the main characters. Very cool movie, very powerful movie. If you're ever looking for something to watch, Gettysburg would be a good recommendation. Here's your learning aid. Here's your memory aid for Gettysburg, the turning point arrow. Just like we had a turning point in the American Revolution, called it Saratoga, we're going to have Gettysburg be the turning point here in the Civil War. And as we've done for every battle so far, Gettysburg, definitely a victory for the boys in blue. The high water mark of the Confederacy, and now they begin their tumble. Well, another thing you probably associate with Gettysburg is President Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. This did not happen at the time of the battle. This actually happens about 4 months later, November 19th, 1863. See, even 4 or 5 months later, there's still bodies strewn about the battlefield. Not everybody has had a chance to be buried yet. Unfortunately, these bodies weren't going to be able to be sent home. So the people of the town of Gettysburg and the Union Army, which stayed behind, they determined to make a military cemetery out of the battlefield. So Lincoln comes to dedicate the battlefield and the military cemetery, which will be there. And he ends up giving a speech that is arguably the most important speech in American history, and perhaps even the most eloquent speech in all the history of the spoken word. Unique thing about this speech is that a lot of people were expecting him to give a really long speech. Okay, that was kind of normal for the time period, to give a very long oration. Actually, there's a man who came in front of him. The man in front of him spoke for 2 hours. And how much do you think we know about the guy who spoke in front of him? How much do we remember of his speech? Nothing. Yeah, now it is written down, not nothing. But it's not the speech that gets highlighted. Some of y'all probably looking at me like, yeah, I wish you talked less as well. Lincoln comes up after this guy who spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln says 272 words, and he changes the tone of the Civil War. His message is that we want to preserve this nation. Listen, there's been a lot of fighting and dying on both sides. Mothers have lost sons in the North and in the South. America doesn't need to be divided like this. We are a collection of one nation of people. What's remarkable about this is that at a time when he could have tap danced on the graves of the Confederates, ha ha ha, you suck, we win, woo! He didn't do that. He didn't make it a victory speech. He didn't make it about the North. He made it about preserving our nation. He acknowledged the hurt and the death on both sides, and he gives a speech of unity. That's going to be one of the major themes of Lincoln's speeches, is unity. He never says, I hate the South. He never says, you deserve to die. He never says, we win, you lose, you suck, woo! Did it again. He says, let's all come together. So we're going to watch a video right here. This is a clip from a docudrama called Lincoln. And I want to give this to you. Me personally, done a lot of reading, research into these topics. This is the most powerful rendition of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that I've ever seen. Now, it is an actor, of course. Okay, we don't have video of the moment. That's Lincoln, but the video you're going to see, it is an actor. But I think this actor just gets it right. I think his voice is right. I think his features are right. I think his mannerisms are right. And when I watch this video, I've watched this video several times before. When I watch this video, it's almost like I can close my eyes and just feel like I am there. And then I open my eyes and I see the man on the screen, and I feel like that's Lincoln talking to me. So I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. Lean into the video, suspend all the distractions around you, and feel like you're there. Let Lincoln deliver the Gettysburg Address to you.
Hello. Hey, yeah. Beautiful name. Hello. I'm going. Hello. Nice to meet you. No, you look taller than they say. I'm better looking. Here you had the rebels here this past summer. Did you find them any?
I had 3 sons, Patton.
Did they come home? Thank you. You have done our country a great service.
Gettysburg will always remain a kind of bright moment for Lincoln. A great victory just when it was so badly needed. And when, in the wake of the battle, people at Gettysburg began planning for the creation of a national cemetery for the fallen Union soldiers there, they extended an invitation to him to participate. And he agrees. And Lincoln very rarely strayed outside of Washington, D.C. That he would take the trouble to come to Gettysburg to speak said a great deal about how important Gettysburg was to him as a symbol. He arrived there on November 18th. Already the town was swollen with crowds, 10 to 15,000 people packed into this little
That's
town.
what used to
no
be a
more than
battlefield, but now
2,500.
people are
A
gathered
great
for the
platform
speech.
had been constructed, and the next day, a crowd formed a great half circle around the platform. There was music, there were choirs, the United States Marine Band played. And the Master of Ceremonies simply said, "The President of the United States."
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far beyond our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
It's this tiny little speech, it's 272 words, yet it distilled all of the truths that he'd been thinking about, including the tragic truth that a great many brave young men on both sides killed each other to make this a better country. And the best way to honor their sacrifice is to recognize that democracy in its purest form is for all people, no matter what their background is.
Lincoln took people to the past, to 1776, and the Declaration of Independence and its proposition, then to the present, to this great civil war that we are engaged in, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And a proposition that all men are created equal, irrespective of their birth, their class, their nation, their religion, their language. Can a nation dedicated to that proposition really, really, seriously survive?
And with this crucial phrase, a new birth of freedom, he was signaling not only the Emancipation Proclamation, but he seemed to be confessing a new birth of something inside of him too, a little bit like a religious rebirth. You see a Lincoln who is dragging his feet about slavery at the beginning of his presidency and was in fact promising not to touch it where it existed, and was always disappointing Frederick Douglass or white abolitionists, is now moving pretty quickly.
Lincoln has changed the character of the war. It now becomes an idea of emancipation.
Woo! Gives me chill bumps every time I think about it. You heard the guys on the screen say, he so masterfully reminded us of the past, 7 years ago. That's 87 years ago. That was what our forefathers signed, the government they created. Takes us to the past, acknowledges the struggles of the present, but then he casts us into the future by saying the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth. That's beyond the scope of his imagination, right? Forever shall not perish from this earth. So a remarkable 272 words, which will live on forever. Here's some true to life pictures here. This is Lincoln on at the podium delivering the speech. So we've talked about photography. You know, you have to stand still. Not hard to get a picture of a dead body. A little bit harder to get a picture of the president giving a speech. I think it's remarkable that we can see some of his facial features. You see a little bit blurrier in the foreground, right? Those soldiers were probably moving around, but pretty remarkable that we got some pictures of his facial features right there. This is a colorized photo of the moment. So Gettysburg was not set to be a battlefield. It's not like, oh yeah, we're definitely going to wage battle at Gettysburg. Gettysburg was a town. Gettysburg had homes and businesses and farms. And what we're looking at right here, people are gathered for the speech, the dedication. But just months earlier, this was the battlefield. All those farmhouses would likely have bullet marks, pock marks, and damages to them from the battle. Here is the whole speech. I'm not going to reread it, of course. We just heard it. A couple of the important phrasings: 7 years ago, this nation shall have a new birth of the freedom, new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Here's how I know this speech is never going to fade away. It's because it's etched in stone in our nation's capital. This is the Lincoln Memorial. Anybody ever been? Washington D.C., Lincoln Memorial. When did you get to go?
I just went last weekend, that's why I wasn't here.
Last weekend you were in Washington D.C.? I didn't know that. You should have brought me some souvenirs. Or I would have given you something to give me some souvenirs. That's really cool. I want to talk to you about your trip. So did you see this with your eyeballs? Shayla, that's really cool. Behind his head, do you recognize the language? It's the Gettysburg Address. See, when you give a speech that's only 272 words long, I guess it's not all that hard to etch it into stone. I firmly believe that this will be around forever. Just like the ancient ruins of Rome and Greece that still exist, this memorial is going to be valued and protected in our nation, and it will never go away. So Lincoln, his face, his body, and his words will be around forever, much like he expected them to be when he delivered them. Finish out the story of Gettysburg like this. This is 50 years later. This is 50 years after the battle. This is the year 1913. And what you have is a reunion of Gettysburg veterans. See, it took a while for our country to reunite, but 50 years of healing later, I think this is remarkable that this is possible. These two men right here, veterans of the battle, a Northerner, a Union guy wearing blue on the left, an old Confederate wearing gray on the right, but sitting side by side, talking to each other, probably telling stories. They may have stared each other down on the battlefield. Their units might have been eyeball to eyeball, muzzle to muzzle. Who knows? Telling stories about what they remember from that 3-day battle. Similar story, picture here of two veterans. Clearly, one is in the dark blue and one is in the gray, shaking hands and telling stories with each other. I imagine they shared a cup of coffee, maybe a meal. This is what healing looks like. I love this colorized version of the same photo. This is what healing in the nation looks like. And it didn't happen fast. This is 50 years later. I imagine these fellas are in their 70s, would have put them in their 20s during the battle. Pretty remarkable that they are still around and able to talk to each other. I'm really glad that we aren't two countries. I'm really glad that the war didn't result in a permanent split. And even though clearly still issues in the country, there's segregation, there's racism. He's wearing his gray. He's probably proud to be an old Confederate. But at least there's an amount of healing that has happened between the adversaries that this moment is able to happen. Last picture along the healing lines here. These are veterans of Pickett's Charge, the charge where the Confederates went 1.5 miles across the open field. These are some survivors of the charge. Surely they saw men cut down right next to them. Their friends died before their eyes. These are the defenders of the charge. They did the killing. They did the shooting at these fellows right here. And here they are at what's known as the angle. Okay, this was the object that both sides were fighting for, this geography right here. 50 years later, reaching out and shaking hands. I can only imagine the stories between them, right? Every one of those men there probably went, got married, had a family, has generations between them now, kids, grandkids, great-grandkids. But here they are 50 years later, healing, remembering what once was. I mean, the guys are still wearing gray. Clearly, they got some Southern sympathies. But healing has happened between them. That's pretty remarkable.
I thought you said none of them lived.
Huh?
Pickett's Charge.
Well, I don't mean to characterize no one as living on Pickett's Charge, but by the time the force approached the Yankee lines, they were definitely combat ineffective, right? From a military perspective, it'd be like losing half of your offensive line. Can you play the game anymore? They lost their strength. So not that nobody lived, but that many of them were cut down, wounded, killed, and they were combat ineffective. Good question, good clarification. All right, well, we are not at 1913 in our story at this point. Let's go back to 1863. And next on your notes here, here's the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is a town in Mississippi, situated right along the Mississippi River. That's why you see a river on your screen there. The Battle of Vicksburg is not one day, it's not 3 days, it's months long. It's a siege. So May, June, and July of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant lays siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Here's why. Vicksburg, Mississippi is a town on the high ground at a very significant bend in the Mississippi River. Bottom line, whoever controlled Vicksburg could control the whole river, and whoever controlled the river controlled the commerce, controlled the transportation, basically controlled the region. You know that control of the Mississippi River was always seen as a key part of the Anaconda Plan. See the key on my screen? So bring you to the map here. This is the Mississippi River. We talked about it yesterday with the Anaconda trying to strangle the South, squeeze the life out of the South. Well, what we have here is Lincoln was very aware of this. Lincoln's own words say this: Vicksburg is the key The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. Y'all ever see me hunting around this room for my keys? I routinely don't have them in my pockets. Lincoln said, we cannot win this war until Vicksburg, the key, is in our pockets. So let me tell you about the Battle of. This is that bend in the Mississippi River. You can see how tight that is. Basically a hairpin turn. Vicksburg, the city, is right here, and this is an elevated ground. So from elevation, whoever controls Vicksburg, you can put guns right there, put your riflemen right there, and you can control this really tight bend in the river. If you're going to do commerce in Mississippi, along the Mississippi River, you have to navigate this turn. So whoever holds Vicksburg holds the river. Whoever holds the river has a significant military and economic advantage. That's why it matters. Well, here's what the Union wants to do about it. The Union at first tries to lay siege to the city. This is Vicksburg, right on the bend. So General Grant, he's coming from the right-hand side of your screen, coming from the east, and he's starting to lay siege to the city. We've talked about siege before. That's where you surround your enemy entirely, choke them of their resources. Food runs low, fresh water runs low, military supplies eventually runs low. Well, something about Vicksburg is that there's a lot of civilians in the town as well, women and children. It's one thing to lay siege to another military. All right, they signed up for that. You're fighting another man. That's one thing. But to lay siege to the women, the children, the elderly in the city as well, Grant wanted to make life as difficult as possible so that they would surrender. They bombarded, the Yankees, the Union, bombarded daily, only taking a break for lunch, like a traditional lunch. The people inside of Vicksburg, they would be holed up in caves that they dug for themselves to protect themselves. They would only come out for about 30 minutes of sunshine whenever the Yankee guns fell silent for lunch. So imagine men, women, child, elderly, holding up in caves, hoping that you don't get hit next, and only coming out for about 30 minutes of fresh air and sunshine on a daily basis. Food ran so low, they started eating dogs and rats. That's all they had left. Fresh water was running low as well. So this goes on for a while, and remarkably, the Mississippians, the people of Vicksburg, are still holding on. The military won't surrender, and the civilians are holding on. Grant comes up with a second idea. It's creative, it's just not successful. His idea is, well, if we can't get Vicksburg to surrender, maybe we can just dig a trench line right here, reroute the river, and then that way the hairpin turn won't matter. If we can make the river connect right here, we control the river, and Vicksburg won't even matter anymore. They tried. They did a lot of digging. They were just never able to get the river to successfully reroute. So that was kind of a failed idea. Well, go back to the siege of Vicksburg. Go back to sieging Vicksburg. And this is what the closing days look like. Blue is Grant. Red is the Confederates. Grant even brought in some naval gunships to be firing from along the water and from along his high positions here. Some serious firepower. So you see the blue squeezing in on the red. And in the closing days of the battle, it's very evident that the Confederates needed to surrender. They wanted to surrender with honor. They wanted to surrender with terms. Well, Grant said no. Grant says unconditional surrender. And that's going to kind of become a second piece of his nickname. You see his initials there, U.S. Grant. Well, U.S., I mean, his name is Ulysses. But the U.S. starts to become known as unconditional surrender Grant. We offer you no terms, no niceties. You don't get to keep your horses. You don't get to keep your guns. You're going to prison. Unconditional surrender. Grant is known for unconditional surrender. Grant actually does a unique thing in Vicksburg, a little bit different than the way he's behaved the rest of the war. He does offer them terms. He lets officers keep their sidearms, and he lets the men keep their horses. Here's why. He says, you are under parole. Okay, when the city falls on, look at that date, July 4th, 1863. How perfect is that, right? Independence Day for America leads to this big victory for Grant as well. He lets the officers keep their sidearms, and he lets the men keep their horses. And what he tells them is, you are on parole. You're not going to jail. You're not going to a camp. Actually, I can't feed you. I don't even have enough food to feed you. But you go home and you plant your fields. Okay, you're out of the war. You're signing these papers here. You're out of the war. Don't go re-enlist. Go home and plant your fields. Okay, go be a farmer again. So he takes about 30,000 Confederates out of the war in that way. I said he didn't have enough food to feed them. He does feed them initially. He just doesn't have enough food to house them for months on end. And that's kind of seen as an act of mercy. He didn't have to give them food, but he saw how starving they were, and he took mercy on them. They are fellow Americans in his perspective. So he fed them and then sent them home. Look at the date there. The city falls to Grant on July 4th, 1863. That's really significant. Here's what this means for the war. The Confederacy is cut in half. Okay, troops and supplies from Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana are cut off from the east. Let me show you this map here. This is the Mississippi River. Okay, this is the river cutting the Confederacy in half. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, they can no longer communicate with the rest of the Confederacy. They can't trade messages. They can't share supplies. They can't transport troops. Because the Union owns the river, it's become a two-front war. This is the Anaconda Plan. Okay, Grant is achieving one of the main objectives of the Anaconda Plan. Show you this map as well. Noah, you kind of brought up the topic I'll point out here as well. This is the river. Okay, this is the dividing line. This is Vicksburg. And similarly, you can see how the Confederacy is cut in two. I also like this map because every dot here represents a battlefield from the Civil War. So you can see, outside of talking about Vicksburg, you can see how many battles were in Virginia. Clearly, a lot of battles happened in Virginia. South Carolina, little hot pocket there in South Carolina. North Georgia, you can see a lot of battles in North Georgia. A little bit more sparse elsewhere, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Indian Territory, future Oklahoma, Missouri. Then you got some randos out here, Colorado, New Mexico, one in Idaho. I don't know how big of a battle that was, but clearly there wasn't fighting out west. The fighting was happening in the east. So that map is very illustrative in that fashion as well. We're going to watch one more video for the day here. This is, again, that docudrama about General Grant and specifically about the siege of Vicksburg. So this video does a very good job of illustrating the things that I've just said. So tuck in, try to be there, smell the gunpowder, be starving like the Confederates, have some sympathy for the prisoners just like Grant did. It's almost lunchtime. You probably are starving. Not like they were starving. Come on, video.
Keep these men digging, Captain. Let's be done with this by nightfall.
Yes, sir. Ulysses S. Grant has now gone down the Mississippi River. He's in the midst of the Vicksburg campaign. In 17 days, Grant's army marched 200 miles and won 5 battles. And now we are talking about a siege.
When Grant first settles into siege operations, he digs a line opposite the Confederate ones, so you can cut off the key routes of supply to the city. And then in case a Confederate force came from his rear, he then dug another series of entrenchments facing the other way.
And now he's going to ring Vicksburg with artillery. In fact, he's even going to bring naval artillery off naval ships to bombard Vicksburg. We want to put them under the maximum pressure so that they recognize this sacrifice is no longer worth it.
The primary strategy of any siege is isolating the people you are besieging inside, causing them to use up both their military resources, but especially their food, to force them to capitulate. So the consequence of this is Grant's army will grow to over 70,000 troops over time, and it's a ratcheting up of military pressure.
Now, the Confederate government in Richmond is rather concerned about the situation at Vicksburg. And there has emerged a group that believes that less focus needs to be placed on the east, where things are going well, and more focus needs to be put on the west, where things are not going well. Robert E. Lee's response is, even if I send troops to Vicksburg, by the time they got there, it might be over. And Lee decides to go north and try to seek a decisive engagement with the Federals north of Pennsylvania. At the same time, Grant keeps the pressure up at Vicksburg to end the siege.
By the end of June, the Confederate Army of Vicksburg was subsisting on a handful of peas and rice issued once a day per man. Even their water would be rationed to 1 cup per man per day.
So now, as the temperature of the summer continues to get hotter and hotter, Grant will dam up all the creeks that are going in there. Confederates are being shelled by Union gunboats as well as Union batteries.
But also throughout the siege, you have a civilian population trapped in the city, estimated at about 2,000. And the citizens lived underground in man-made caves to escape the constant bombardment of Union cannon and heavy mortar. And about the only time they came out of these caves is when the Union artillerymen ate their morning, noon, and evening meals.
Grant knows full well the suffering of the civilians in Vicksburg. He doesn't relish any of it, but I think he does believe, without breaking the will of the Southern people, that this war is not going to come to an end.
These civilians in Vicksburg, who weeks earlier were able to get all the food they needed, were clearly stuck.
Imagine the well-to-do Southern aristocrats who can't have their regular foods anymore.
When it comes to driving gear, there's all-out go and all-out stomp.
Harvey. And they started eating anything that moved, rats included. And by early July, it was clear that the Confederates were near the end of their rope.
On July 3rd, 2 persons were seen coming towards our lines bearing a white flag. It was a glorious sight to soldiers on the line.
And on the hot afternoon of July 3rd, at the very same time Pickett's legions were storming over the stone wall at Gettysburg, the Confederate commander, John Pemberton, would ask Grant on what terms he would receive the surrender of the city.
General Pemberton,
Your terms, General, surprise me.
I propose. No proposals. Terms won't change. Unconditional surrender.
Sir.
Listen, we need offer terms. Be practical. What are we going to do with 30,000 prisoners? Then offer terms. What do you think?
General, I'm prepared to accept the parole, but only if my men walk away with all of their personal property.
By personal property, do you mean to include slaves?
Slaves.
Sidearms, horses, no slaves. No slaves leave with you.
Grant says slaves are not your property. You're not leaving with the slaves. They're coming to my army as freedmen.
And we attack the city.
So he's given them the terms. If they accept, they'll be paroled. If they don't accept, Grant will continue firing. And it looks like they accepted. Happy 4th of July.
But to this point, Grant's reputation is unconditional surrender Grant. And yet here he paroles the men that are there. and it shows what flexibility of mind he had. I think he makes the calculus of, what if we send these 30,000 scarecrows back to their towns? What are they gonna tell them? We just got whipped.
General Grant. Maintain your side arms, General. The enemy had been suffering, particularly towards the last. I saw our men taking bread from their haversacks and giving it to the enemy they had so recently been engaged in starving out.
Grant doesn't have a hatred of Southern people. He sees them as Americans that have gone astray. He doesn't agree with their cause, but he cares for the people themselves. That really colors the way he deals with Confederates throughout the Civil War.
Vicksburg surrenders and the Mississippi is open. And as Lincoln says, the Father of waters flows again, unvexed to the city.
The Father of Waters, or the Key, as we know he called it. Here's your memory aid for Vicksburg. Come on now, let's finish strong. Memory aid on your notes there for Vicksburg. I want you to draw a river and a key. Here's my tip for Vicksburg. Any question on any exam in the context of the Civil War that mentions the Mississippi River is referring to Vicksburg. So whether it's my benchmark exam or the EOC from the state of Georgia, could be fill in the blank, could be matching, could be a chart, could be a map. If it references the Mississippi River, it is talking about the Battle of Vicksburg. What did General Grant do at the Mississippi River? Battle of Vicksburg. Battle of Vicksburg was fought over what major geographic feature? The Mississippi River. Those two are always associated, Vicksburg and the Mississippi River. It's the key that we had to put into our pocket. I'll give you one other way to help you remember. Vicksburg starts with a V. V for Vicksburg. Well, what was the result of the battle? That it split the South in half. So just like a V kind of has two sides to it, what did the river do? It split the South in half at Vicksburg. So the key is the river. It split the South in half. That's how you can remember Vicksburg. Vicksburg, of course, is a victory for the boys in blue and General Ulysses S. Grant. His reputation is really secured at this point. Lincoln calls him back towards Washington to lead the whole army now, not just the army in the West, but he is now the leader of the whole Union Army. Follow the dates here. Okay, I hope you caught it. July 1, 2, and 3, we're battling in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Big victory for the Union. July 4, after a 3-month-long siege, we wrap up the victory at Vicksburg. So what we have here are two major victories within 48 hours. Really kind of like co-turning points. Now I know we're going to call Gettysburg the turning point, but Vicksburg, one day later, it's right there in significance as well. So the take here is at this point, Union victory is inevitable at this point. We do still have a little bit more war to fight, but at this point, Union victory certainly seems inevitable. Well, enter into the story, Uncle Billy, as I like to call him, General William Tecumseh Sherman. Probably one of Georgia's least favorite characters. Like, if I'm being honest, your grandparents, probably your great-grandparents, maybe have some negative words to say about General Sherman. I'm being serious here. Go back just a couple generations. Folks in Georgia don't super like William Tecumseh Sherman. Here's why. He sieges the city of Atlanta. Very similar to the way Grant sieged Vicksburg. Sherman, Grant's old buddy, Sherman does the same thing to the city of Atlanta. July, August, September 1864, surrounds the city, starves it of food, water, and resources until it falls to its knees and surrenders. So about 6 weeks long of a siege. General William Tecumseh Sherman besieges Atlanta, Georgia, and obviously this brings it really close to home. Obviously, this is something that we can contextualize because imagine all y'all pass through Atlanta in some fashion, driving there, airport there. Okay, the airport sometimes is a good starting point for maybe another flight that you're going to take. A lot of people pass through Atlanta for a lot of reasons. Here's why it mattered to Sherman. Atlanta was a significant Confederate hub of industry, manufacturing, and railroads. I just mentioned the airport, okay? You know, Billy Yank here, I've traveled through time before. I know what an airplane is. Today, Atlanta is known for its airport. That airport receives thousands of flights on a daily basis. And whether someone's staying in Atlanta or not, hundreds of thousands of people pass through Atlanta for transportation. Well, similarly, in 1864, it wasn't airplanes, but it was rail. Atlanta was a hub for railroads. A lot of railroads crossed through Atlanta. Even if it wasn't their final stop, it was a passing point, and they all connected in Atlanta. Maybe like a highway or a big spaghetti junction passage, which is also in Atlanta. That's what the railroads were in Atlanta in 1864. I know previously I said the South had fewer railroads. This is true. But they didn't have zero railroads. Okay, they did have some rail. They did have some industry and manufacturing, and most of it was in Atlanta. So Sherman recognizes that bringing Atlanta to its knees could bring the South to its knees. Disrupting railroads in Atlanta will disrupt Confederate supply lines across the whole region. So that's the significance of Atlanta. Here's after Atlanta surrenders. Okay, the city falls on September 2nd, 1864. You might think that's enough. Okay, the city has fallen. Sherman has taken control of the city. Not enough for Sherman. Sherman really wants to land that final blow to the Confederates, to the whole nation. It's almost like he wants to bring the Confederacy itself to the point of their knees and exhaustion and total surrender. So what he does is he burns Atlanta to the ground. It's not enough just to capture the city. Burns the city to the ground. Go find something in Atlanta today that's older than 1864. You won't. There are no buildings in Atlanta that say founded in the year 1750. Sherman burned it all to the ground. So he burns Atlanta to the ground. And what does he do after that? Does he stop there? He does not. He marches to the sea. Marches from Atlanta to Savannah. That's a distance of 285 miles. And he does the same thing along the whole route, destroying anything of military use to the Confederacy along his way. So livestock, well, that can feed the troops, that can feed the Confederates. It's part of the Confederate economy, burn it. Crops, if it makes money for the Confederacy, if it feeds them, burn it. Farmhouses, railroads, rip up the rail ties, bend them so they can't be used again. Anything of military or economic significance in his path, he burned and destroyed and made it useless to the South. Sherman didn't love war. Sherman's not a murderer. He's not killing innocent civilians along the way. He's trying to end the war. He's trying to win the game for the Union and bring the South to its knees. So memory aid here, okay, in your circle. I want you to draw a peach for Atlanta, okay, to reference Georgia, a peach for Atlanta, barbed wire for sieging, surrounding Atlanta, and fire for burning it to the ground. Peach for Georgia, Atlanta, barbed wire for the siege, fire for burning it to the ground. Maybe as a little bonus, there's not a circle there, but as a little bonus, you can draw some boots to indicate that he marched to the sea afterwards. His route's going to take him from Atlanta to Savannah. That's generally south and east. We'll show you a map here in just a second of a lot of the towns that he marched through. Now, when I say he marched to the sea, it wasn't in a single file line. Okay? It wasn't like his 15,000 soldiers just were all in a single file line. They spread out. His units spread out. They actually spread out as far as 50 miles. So what you get is a 285-mile long path, all of that being 50 miles wide. Burned and destroyed a lot of towns between Atlanta and Savannah. Once he got to Savannah, he actually continued north to the Carolinas. Not quite as known. Usually we think the march to the sea, we think about Georgia. General Sherman burned Georgia, but he also does turn north to the Carolinas and continues his march into the Carolinas. Here's that map I promised you. You probably recognize some of what you're looking at here. This is the state of Georgia. First of all, let's find us. Okay, we're the yellow star. This is Alma. So it doesn't quite come to where we are here today, but just north of us, I imagine you recognize some of these towns. Atlanta, you heard of Decatur, McDonough, Covington, and all the vampires. Milledgeville, Macon, Irwinton. Okay, Irwin, we play Irwin in sports around here. Sandersonville, up to, and then the final town being Savannah. So all of these towns along the way, you will not find anything older than 1864. You will not go to Macon and find some old building from the 1700s. It doesn't exist. It got burned to the ground by Sherman on his march to the sea. Now, Sherman was on a deadline. Sherman wanted to give Savannah to President Lincoln for Christmas. He wanted to arrive in Savannah before Christmas, and in the end, he did. He arrived in Savannah just before Christmas, and he telegrams President Lincoln, Mr. President, I have a gift for you. It's Savannah. I give you Savannah for Christmas. Of course, that was going to be good for Lincoln's re-election prospects. And going into the next year, going into 1865, things were looking up for actually bringing a close to the war. Cool story about Savannah itself. So the residents of Savannah, the city council, the leaders of Savannah, they saw what was coming. They knew Sherman was coming their way. They actually go to meet him at the edge of the city, and they say, General Sherman, sir, we recognize what you've been doing. We understand you burned every town between here and Atlanta, 200 miles long, 50 miles wide. Please, sir, we request that you don't burn our city to the ground. Savannah is a beautiful city, historic city, got a lot of beautiful infrastructure in Savannah. We submit to you, okay, we surrender the city to you, and we request that you do not burn it to the ground. And he did not. Sherman enters Savannah and does not burn it to the ground. So you could go to Savannah today and find structures that are older than 1864 because he did not burn it to the ground. It was one of those extensions of peace. The war is almost over. Not quite yet, but the war is almost over. And hey, we're going to have to rebuild everything that we damaged. So it's kind of Sherman's first extension of reconstruction, saying that he will not destroy Savannah. There's some really cool landmarks in Savannah where Sherman and his troops were. There's a particular house in Savannah where he set up his headquarters. You could go and see that. You could go and see some of the historic locations where Sherman's army was in Savannah today. Really cool piece of our own Georgia history. So Sherman's march to the sea, a couple pictures here to illustrate. These are his soldiers tearing up the rail lines. They didn't just take over the territory. They destroyed the rail lines along the way as well. Eventually, they would have to rebuild them. So Sherman's march to the sea is strongly a Union victory. All right, pushing to the very finish line here. Let's finish strong. We got plenty of time. Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. Appomattox is a town in Virginia. Robert E. Lee has 28,000 of his soldiers left in his Army of Northern Virginia. That might sound like a lot. I mean, compared to the population of Alma, that's a lot. But that's actually not a lot for the size of his army. On the other side, General Grant had 125,000, so about 5 times as many. Lee and his troops are being beaten daily. He's experiencing desertions. Soldiers are just leaving his army, going AWOL. Starvation, lack of resources, running out of ammunition. The end is near. The end is near for General Lee. So on the morning of April 9th, 1865, he sends a message to the Union lines. Hey, this is General Lee, and I request to meet with General Grant. They meet at a farmhouse, not a fancy place, not some ceremony place, just a farmhouse. You can see they shake hands, just like the picture depicts. And General Lee offers his army for surrender. General Grant accepts. They write out the terms. They both sign. And this is effectively the end of the Civil War. Lee surrenders 28,000 Confederate troops. And although there are still some Confederate troops throughout the rest of the region, you imagine it takes a while for the message to spread. But once Lee surrendered, see, Lee was held up as the God general. Lee is the guy that could do no wrong. If Bobby Lee thought it was over, it was over. So the other Confederate forces surrendered within the month shortly thereafter. We consider Appomattox to be the end of the Civil War. Interesting thing here is even the Confederate president didn't want to surrender. He did not approve of Robert E. Lee surrendering. Jefferson Davis is actually escaping further south. He's leaving Richmond, and he's going to come all the way to the middle of Georgia before he's captured. We'll talk about that next week. But Robert E. Lee basically went against his presidential orders. Even though the president was still trying to live to fight another day, Robert E. Lee said, yeah, it's over. It's over. Surrenders his troops, and this effectively ends the Civil War. Here's our two key characters. Love to point this out. So this is the day of surrender. This is the moment of surrender. And Robert E. Lee puts on his Confederate vest, puts on his best gray coat, his vest, his trousers, his bow tie, his overcoat, clean, spick and span, as fresh of a uniform as he had, puts on his very best. Grant, on the other hand, he arrives to the farmhouse they agreed to go to, in a muddy uniform. Grant was a muddy boot soldier, right? He had boots on, or he had mud on his boots. He was wearing literally a private uniform. Now, it had rank on his shoulders, but on the day of the surrender, he was wearing just a private uniform. So just the lowest soldier with his general's rank on it. Two very different men, okay? Older and distinguished, almost like a statesman, hard scrabble soldier, chews the tobacco, smokes the cigars, cusses out the boys. People called him the butcher. Two very different characters. And at the same time, they had a lot of similarities. Both of them fought in the Mexican-American War. Both of them graduated from West Point, so they got trained at the same place. A little bit of an age difference. Robert E. Lee was the superintendent at West Point, while Grant was a cadet. So they crossed paths. Basically, he's the superintendent, and he's the student. And now you have the opposite. You have the younger man receiving the surrender of the older man. This is kind of what the surrender looked like. The Confederates were to lay down their arms, but similar to what we said before, Grant had a lot of compassion for the surrendering Confederates. He realized that the war was essentially over, and he knew that the rebuilding starts now. So just like he did at Vicksburg, he sent them home with lenient terms, very lenient terms. He said, keep your sidearms and keep your horses. And listen, go back home and plant. Okay, it's April. It's growing season. If you leave now, you can get back to your farms and you can plant a crop for this season. We are all Americans again. There's actually a moment. This is the moment of surrender. Okay, they're surrendering their flags. They're laying down their arms. There is a moment where, well, I'll get to that in a second. This is a picture of kind of what it might have looked like for the actual moment of surrender. You see Grant had a lot of Union officers behind him. Lee showed up to the farmhouse with just a couple of assistants. This is kind of inside the room, and even the actual chairs and table where they surrendered. Look at this. This is the actual two chairs that these men were in. So I'll click back and forth real quick here. Look at Lee's chair. He's got that high back wicker chair. Looks just like it, that high back wicker chair. He's got the chair with the black padding. Look at the table. Looks pretty similar. So these are the actual items that these men were using for the surrender. Like I said, it wasn't fancy. It wasn't a lot of pomp and circumstance. It was just a piece of paper that they both signed and agreed upon. Another picture kind of shows the insides of the room. This is the actual room today. You can go to Appomattox Courthouse, visit it kind of like a tourist. I think they did pretty good. They got the carpet right. They got that bureau right. They got the fireplace right. Pretty impressive place to visit. I've never been. I'd love to go. Appomattox Courthouse certainly is a Union victory. And here's your memory aid. Here's how you're going to remember it. The white flag of surrender. This is where the Confederates surrendered for the final time. Sometimes I think about how the letter A is the first letter of the alphabet, but Appomattox is the last battle of the Civil War. Another thing, you might think it has the letter X in it. X marks the spot of the surrender. Just trying to give you some ways to remember it. Appomattox Courthouse. Funny word, hard to say. Appomattox Courthouse is where the surrender happens. At the moment of the surrender, you can imagine boys like myself, Union boys like myself, really happy, jubilant, cheering. There's a military band started to strike up some music. General Grant came out and he shushed the band. He said, the war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. And this was the beginning of rebuilding our country. Hang on. I got a couple more here. We're going to finish before the bell, I promise. So, I mean, if you're Abraham Lincoln, imagine how excited you are. You've led the nation only in wartime. You never had a chance to lead the nation through a peaceful period. You just got reelected. The war is over. Maybe you're looking forward to some good things. Well, April 9th is when Lee surrendered. A couple days later, you and your wife, you've had a hard couple of years. Hey, I got it. Let's go to the theater. Let's have a relaxing night out. April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater, and unfortunately, that's the end of the story for him. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, enters the presidential box, shoots the president behind his left ear, and Lincoln does not survive to experience the victory of the war. He's alive only for 5 days. From Lee's surrender to his own death, only 5 days. And that is a tragedy of the story that we will tell next week. The war officially ends on May 10th, 1865. That's when Jefferson Davis is captured in Georgia. I'm not quite sure if blue and gray are really shaking hands at this time, but we say May 10th, when Jefferson Davis was captured, is really the end of the war. Final piece on your notes here. So the effects of the war. America is, quotey fingers, reunited. I don't know about being reunited, but at least we can say that the rebuilding has begun. The era of Reconstruction begins in the South. Think of it like this. 87 years rebuilding a country, 4 years to tear it down, and then we have to rebuild again. This next period of U.S. history is going to be called Reconstruction. Just like the picture you see on the screen there, all that rubble, all that bombed out, mess in the South. Much of the South was left in physical and economic devastation. Rounded out like this. Last thing for you to write for the day. Altogether, if you adjust money into the present day, altogether the cost of the war for the Union was $6.7 billion. It's a lot of money. Imagine this. Now, I'm not saying this would have been possible. I don't think Southern growers would have agreed to this. But if the federal government could have purchased the freedom of every slave and granted each family a 40-acre farm for $3.1 billion. Now, I don't think the Southerners were going to sell their slaves that easily and grant them freedom through sale. But the cost of the war was literally double what it would have been to purchase the freedom of every slave at the outset. Anyway, here we are into the era of Reconstruction. And that is what we will talk about next week. Hey, y'all, thanks for your time and attention, of course. Billy Yank been here today. So briefly, what I'm wearing, this is the uniform of the New York Militia. I can tell, so very specifically, the New York Militia had a dark blue top and the light blue pants, and the epaulets. The epaulets on the top of my shoulders is kind of what makes it the New York Militia. This is called a 4-inch cap, a little bit more industrialized. Talk about how the Southerners maybe had to stitch their own uniforms. All of this comes a little bit more from the factory. The canteen, has that cloth wrapping on it, just a little bit more industrialized. Cartridge box, powder box, all of these items. So this is what would have carried my bullets. This is what would have carried the powder or the powder cap. So each of these necessary for reloading the gun. Same thing with a haversack here. This is a little bit more waterproof. Kind of has a little bit of rubber on it. Kind of has a waterproof. I know you guys are really interested in the camp toy from yesterday. Well, in my haversack here today, Sam, what I got? Got some playing cards. Another way the soldiers would often pass the time. And then last piece here. I didn't wear these today. Same reason as yesterday. This just kind of speaks to the northern industry. A lot of Union shoes had studs on them, like these hobnails, almost like making cleats. I think like soccer cleats or football cleats. So I certainly wasn't going to wear this on the floor, but you can imagine how that would be helpful on the battlefield, having a little bit of grip on your shoes. All right, my friends, you may get your phones. I hope these past 2 days have been enjoyable, and we still have several more to go in the Civil War.